Hi, everybody. This is Todd Krieger. So I'll be talking about addiction today and over the next few times. Today, I want to talk about the relationship between addiction and stress and how stress can lead to being more vulnerable to addiction, how stress um, can be, well, I'll say addiction can be a way to escape from stress and just the entire relationship between stress and addiction. It's complicated. I'm going to talk a little neurobiology, not a whole lot, because this isn't my graduate class. I did a lot of teaching to graduate students when I was a professor on this topic. But it is important to at least honor and respect that there is neurobiology, not just psychology, that's involved. So, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on bona fide good research. And I would say that if you can appreciate the connection between stress and addiction, that maybe you'll know somebody that can be helped by what I'm about to talk about. That there is definitely that relationship. So obviously, learning how to regulate stress is very key. Now, the other aspect of it is being addicted causes stress too. So it can be bidirectional. I'll be talking mostly about stress, how that leads to more vulnerability to addiction, but addiction can, of course, lead to more stress. So, first, I want to talk about is what research has shown is that negative life events, such as loss of a parent, parental divorce and conflict, low parental support, physical violence and abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, isolation, single parent family structures, all of those have been associated with increased risk of substance abuse. All of them have. Um, and overwhelming evidence exists for an increased association between childhood sexual and physical abuse and victimization and increased drug use and abuse. There's been a lot of studies on that. So when you think about stress, of course, you can think about having a stressful work environment, but this is really talking also about just lifespan ongoing stressors. Now, there's also some evidence that recent negative life events and physical and sexual abuse, as adults, each exert some risk on addiction vulnerability. Well, addiction vulnerability, meaning I've said this a few times, a more higher probability that a person might move towards addiction. There's definitely some evidence on that as well. Um, there's also been studies that have shown a significant association between the prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders, including PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, behavioral conduct problems, and increased risk of substance use disorders. So stress is significantly associated with the prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders. These associations, make us think that, definitely um, some of these psychiatric disorders can be conceptualized as chronic stress states or distress states. And that can largely account for the significant association between stress and substance use disorders. So I just want to give you a little bit of background in that. Um, there's also shown that there's an accumulation effect that lifetime exposure to stressors and cumulative adversity can lead to more addiction vulnerability. And that seems to be across all ethnicities and genders. Doesn't change for that. So kind of rewinding for a second and talking about the word stress. Stress is not good or bad. There is good stress, I guess I could say it that way. Uh, when I went hiking with my wife and this other couple this past weekend this past, not just weekend, but kind of a very long weekend or a short week in Yosemite. We went up a few hikes that were really stressful on the body, but it was good stress. It challenged the body. We challenged our bodies. It's also stressful when, because of all the rains that we had, that when we got up close to the vernal falls, we were drenched. Might as well have jumped in a pool. There's a certain amount of discomfort in that, a little bit of stress involved in that, but that's good stress. There's also other kinds of good stress, and a um, psychologically, I mean, challenging ourselves to do something that we're not very good at or we're new at can cause stress, but it's a short-term stress, it's healthy stress. It actually builds brain cells as we learn new things. We understand that learning builds brain cells, whether we're learning how to ride a bike or learning a new foreign language or learning organic chemistry or learning how to sew. These all build, and there's all some inherent good stress involved in that, which is good. It's mild to moderate stress. What leads to addiction and more vulnerability to addiction isn't that kind of stress. It's more long-term stress. It's stress that overloads the system. We can call that bad stress. It's when it's severe stress or it's stress that just continues on and on and on. Living in a stressful environment where there is no end. When I was challenging my body, when I got to the top, I could, everything's downhill from here. Okay. Or when we learn a new foreign language that's stressful, we we master some things and there's a sense of achievement and there's an actual positive feeling. When we're trying something new that's good stress, sometimes there's a feeling of excitement and it motivates us to do the best we can and motivate us to learn. None of those things that's not what causes an increase of a stress addiction, of addiction to a vulnerability addiction, is what I meant. The kind of stress that leads to more of an addiction potential is the long-term stress and the constant stress. So, I mentioned quickly, that definitely life adverse events like a child having to go through a parental divorce or conflict or abandonment or living apart from a dear person. Okay, now, one of the things I would tell you that the other side of this bad stress is when you have someone, at least one person or more, that can help you process the event. And I've talked about this in terms of trauma and PTSD, but I have noticed even in my own practice that people who had people there for them, even when they went through tremendous trauma, were much less likely to turn to alcohol or drugs. I want to mention a little neurobiology too. What we find is one of the parts of the brain that's involved in addiction is the nucleus accumbens, it's called. And what we find is that there's like a reward structure. A person gets a drug or alcohol, and there's an enhanced, typically dopamine release, depending on the drug or alcohol. It could be other kinds of neurotransmitters. And this release is in the nucleus accumbens part of the brain. Stress exposure, increased level of glucocorticoids, which is the stress hormone called cortisol, is a main kind of glucocorticoid. When we have that stress exposure and increased levels of these glucocorticoids, that enhances the dopamine release even more, and the nucleus accumbens, which then again it makes people more vulnerable to addiction and substance abuse. Now, another part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex that we have, that part of the brain helps people regulate their amygdala. The amygdala is the alarm system of the brain. I'm not going to go give you too many more brain terms, but the amygdala is the alarm system of the brain that can trigger stress responses. And we have what's called a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that kicks into gear, and it ultimately goes from one thing to another and leads to the release of cortisol, adrenaline from the adrenal glands. Well, the prefrontal cortex, it can be used to help people contextualize and 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 self-soothe. I'll be talking about self-soothing in another talk, but the prefrontal cortex can be used to help people temper the stress response, to regulate. And so it regulates these stress responses. Well, stress, especially early life stress, prolonged stress, repeated stress, actually can affect the development of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the development of the prefrontal cortex is highly dependent on environmental experiences for maturation and for growth. And so, if it's in a rich environment, we have a healthy prefrontal cortex, which then can be used to help modulate our own stress. So, I'm trying to say there is a neurobiological, it's almost like a double whammy when a person is in a stressful early environment. It's stressful itself, but also the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, these are parts of the brain that help regulate stress. They don't get formed as well. They're not as well developed. And so we lose, at least partially, the ability of the brain, these parts of the brain, to regulate our stress levels. So we're even more stressed and even more prone to something like addiction. Because addiction then gives us that escape. It gives us a temporary relief from the feelings that get relief, from the release of the cortisol. See, I'm trying to put it all together for you. Um, so the executive functions, the prefrontal cortex, the ability to calm ourselves down and self-soothe are less. So at the same time, going the other direction, when a person is developing an addiction, is becoming more and more dependent on some substance, that their capacity, they surely don't develop these parts of their brain anymore that can regulate, like the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus. So uh, what it, what happens is it surely doesn't get better, it probably gets worse, that a person becomes more dependent on these drugs or alcohol to help regulate their emotions, and they lose more and more the ability to self-regulate. Not to mention, addictions can cause, of course, relationship problems between spouses and family and friends and employers and employees, which could again cause more stress, which then can lead to, even more of a tendency to escape through addiction. So I'm painting that picture. Of course, what that tells us is, in terms of an aspect of treating someone who's addicted, is aside from, of course, helping them do everything we can to help them get sober so that they can now have a chance to learn how to regulate, it is to regulate their emotions. So, why I find it so important for people that come to me to get sober first is because the only chance I really have to help people is to help them learn how to regulate their emotions better. Because that's really um, the only way out of this conundrum. So they have to stop first, become sober, and then feel their feelings, and then develop the skills to regulate. And as they develop the skills to regulate, this is the good news. There's what we call neuroplasticity in the brain, and the brain can build new networks between neurons, and we could literally develop brain structure. And that has been shown in studies with PTSD, but it's the same with this as well. That we could literally grow the hippocampus, which is one of those parts of the brain that can help regulate. And when a person has been through a lot of trauma, a lot of PTSD, a lot of stress, that they showed, for example, with EMDR, with combat victims, 8 sessions of EMDR, they found that the hippocampus would grow. So I'm trying to say that with the proper treatment, finding ways to get sober, proper treatment for the to increase the capacity to regulate emotionally can actually help people neurobiologically as well as psychologically. So then we get this positive spiral upward because, of course, as a person learns to regulate their emotions and they don't use their addictions to escape from stress, when they learn how to deal with their stress, regulate their stress, manage it, work with it, problem solve from it, then of course their relationships get better and the potential to make more money gets better. And there's a upward spiral of health and um, a de-escalation of the stress response and the accompanying vulnerability to continue using drugs or alcohol. So I hope that helps. It's just a little bit of a way of understanding and looking at the relationship between stress and addiction. And I'll be talking more about addiction in upcoming talks. Thanks for listening. This is Todd Krieger, making the world safe for love.